The porcelain clinked softly against the saucer, a delicate sound that belonged to drawing rooms where fortunes were discussed in whispers and marriages were arranged over lukewarm Earl Grey. Amelia Whitmore had learned long ago to hold her cup just so, not too high, never drawing attention, always proper. She had mastered the art of being present without being seen. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Lady Hartsworth's London townhouse, casting golden squares across the Persian rug where 24 women sat in careful clusters. Their voices rose and fell like practiced music, discussing the season's eligible bachelors with the precision of generals planning a campaign. Amelia listened without listening, smiled without meaning, and waited for the acceptable moment when she could excuse herself without causing offense. She was 32 years old in an era that considered her past hope, not old enough to be a proper spinster aunt, not young enough to still dream of advantageous matches. She existed in that peculiar limbo reserved for women of gentle birth but modest means, invited to gatherings out of politeness, ignored once she arrived. The tea room buzzed with the particular energy that came when society's matrons gathered to assess and catalogue. Amelia had learned to read these gatherings like others read books, understanding the subtle hierarchies in seating arrangements, the meaning behind carefully chosen words. She knew, for instance, that Mrs. Pemberton's placement near the window signified her daughter's successful engagement to Lord Ashford. She knew that the absence of the Duchess of Somerset spoke volumes about some unspoken scandal that would be whispered about in corners for weeks. This was the world Amelia inhabited but never quite belonged to. She moved through it like a shadow, necessary for the contrast but never the focus of attention. Her gown was 3 seasons old, carefully maintained and subtly altered to appear less dated. Her gloves had been mended so skillfully that only the closest inspection would reveal the repair. Everything about her presentation spoke of careful economy, of a woman making the most of limited resources. "Miss Whitmore, you're looking rather pale. Are you quite well?" Amelia glanced up to find Mrs. Catherine Morris studying her with the kind of concern that wasn't really concern at all. It was observation, cataloguing, the social equivalent of a naturalist examining a specimen. "Perfectly well, thank you," Amelia replied, her voice carrying the practiced pleasantness she'd perfected over years of similar exchanges. "The tea is lovely." Mrs. Morris nodded, already losing interest, her attention drawn to the young Miss Pemberton, who had just entered wearing a gown that must have cost more than Amelia's annual income. The girl was 18, beautiful, and blessed with a dowry that made grown men weep with joy. She was everything Amelia had never been. Amelia took another sip of tea, letting the ritual comfort her. She didn't resent Miss Pemberton. How could she resent someone for possessing what society valued? It would be like resenting the sun for shining. Instead, Amelia had learned to find contentment in small things: a well-written book, a morning walk through Hyde Park before the fashionable crowds arrived, the satisfaction of managing her modest household accounts with precision. Her rooms in Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house were small but clean, with a window that looked out onto a narrow street where tradesmen made their deliveries and children played in the gutters. It wasn't Mayfair, but it was respectable enough. Mrs. Fletcher was kind, often including Amelia in family meals when she sensed the younger woman's loneliness had grown particularly acute. There were worse fates than the one Amelia had carved out for herself. Yet sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, she allowed herself to remember the girl she'd been at 18, full of dreams about teaching, about making a difference, about finding love that transcended social calculations. That girl had believed the world was larger than drawing rooms and tea services, that there were possibilities beyond what society prescribed. Life had taught her otherwise. Her father's death had been sudden, a heart seizure that left him dead before the doctor could arrive. The debts that followed had been equally sudden, swallowing their modest estate like a hungry beast. Her mother had tried to maintain appearances, to pretend nothing had changed, but the strain had worn her down until illness claimed her too. At 24, Amelia had found herself alone with no family, no fortune, and no prospects beyond the charity of distant relations who viewed her as an obligation to be minimally fulfilled. She'd learned quickly that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, that survival required swallowing dignity and accepting whatever scraps of kindness were offered. Miss Whitmore. The voice was different this time, softer, more genuine. Amelia looked up and felt her breath catch slightly. Lady Margaret Blackwood stood before her, and despite the crowded room it felt suddenly as though they were alone. Margaret Blackwood was a woman who defied easy description. She was perhaps 55, with silver threading through dark hair she refused to powder in the old style. Her eyes were remarkable, a deep grey that seemed to see through the careful masks everyone wore. She was the widow of the late Duke of Thornbury, mother to the current Duke, and possessed a reputation for eccentricity that her wealth and title allowed her to indulge. The Dowager Duchess had been known to champion unexpected causes, to befriend people society deemed unsuitable, to speak her mind with a frankness that would have ruined anyone with less consequence. She collected artists and intellectuals the way other women collected porcelain figurines, hosting salons that were simultaneously sought after and slightly scandalous. "Lady Margaret," Amelia said, setting down her cup and preparing to rise. "Please, don't stand." Margaret settled into the chair beside her, moving with a grace that suggested she couldn't care less what anyone thought of her sitting with the least important person in the room. "I've been hoping to speak with you." Amelia blinked. "With me? Don't look so surprised. I've been watching you, Miss Whitmore, for several months now, actually." A cold thread of unease wound through Amelia's chest. Being noticed was never good. It meant you'd done something wrong, drawn attention somehow, disrupted the careful social order. She frantically searched her memory for any misstep, any moment where she might have caused offense or broken some unspoken rule. "I assure you I haven't meant to." "Breathe, child," Margaret said, and there was warmth in her voice that startled Amelia into silence. "You haven't done anything wrong. Quite the opposite. I've noticed that you listen more than you speak. You observe rather than perform. And when you do speak, your words carry actual thought rather than empty pleasantries." Amelia didn't know what to say to that. She'd spent so long learning to fade into wallpaper that being truly seen felt almost violent. It was as though Margaret had reached inside her chest and touched something Amelia had kept carefully protected. "I've also noticed," Margaret continued, her voice dropping slightly, "that you read. Actually read. I saw you at Hatchard's last month, spending an hour in the philosophy section. You purchased a volume of Locke, if I remember correctly." Heat flooded Amelia's cheeks. She had indeed bought that book, spending money she should have saved, but unable to resist the lure of ideas and arguments that made her mind feel alive. "I enjoy philosophy. It helps me think about things differently." "Precisely. You have an active mind, Miss Whitmore, a curious one. That's rare in our circles, where most women are taught that thinking too deeply is unbecoming." Margaret's smile held approval. "I also noticed that you speak to Lady Hartsworth's companion with genuine kindness. Not the patronizing courtesy some offer servants, but real respect. You see people, not just their positions." The observation made Amelia uncomfortable in its accuracy. Mary, Lady Hartsworth's companion, was a woman of similar age and circumstances to Amelia herself. They'd struck up a quiet friendship built on shared understanding of what it meant to exist on society's margins. Speaking kindly to Mary wasn't virtue. It was recognizing a fellow traveler. Margaret leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that forced Amelia to lean in as well. "I wonder if you might spare me a few minutes of your time, somewhere more private. I have a proposition that I believe might interest you." "A proposition? Nothing scandalous, I assure you." Margaret's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Well, perhaps slightly scandalous, but only in the most delightful way." Before Amelia could formulate a response, Margaret had risen and was gliding toward the door with the expectation that Amelia would follow. And she did, because what else could she do? When a Dowager Duchess requested your presence, you followed. The other women in the room barely glanced up as they left. Amelia was too insignificant to merit curiosity, and Margaret too important to question. It was perfect anonymity. They left the drawing room behind, moving through the corridor to a smaller parlour that Lady Hartsworth used for more intimate gatherings. Margaret closed the door behind them. Not quite proper, but then again, Margaret Blackwood had long since earned the privilege of defining her own version of proper. "Please sit," Margaret said, settling into a chair by the window. Amelia sat, her hands folded carefully in her lap, her mind racing through possibilities. Perhaps Lady Margaret needed a companion, or wanted to recommend her for a position in some household. These were the kinds of propositions women in Amelia's position received. Offers of employment, of usefulness, of being needed in some capacity that allowed them to maintain the pretense of genteel poverty, rather than admitting they were working for survival. She prepared herself to be gracious, to accept whatever was offered with appropriate gratitude. She'd become skilled at this over the years, the delicate balance of accepting help while maintaining dignity, of being grateful without being obsequious. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore, what do you know of my son?" The question caught Amelia off guard. Whatever she'd expected, it wasn't this. The Duke of Thornbury. Sebastian, yes. Amelia searched her memory for the scraps of information she'd gathered over the years. The Duke of Thornbury was a figure more discussed than seen, at least in the circles where Amelia moved. He's well-regarded, honourable. He inherited the title 7 years ago after your husband's passing. He's 34, 35. 35, Margaret confirmed. What else? He's considered an excellent match, very eligible. Amelia felt herself flushing slightly. These were not things one typically discussed directly. He hasn't married. No, he hasn't. Margaret's expression shifted, sadness flickering across her features. Do you know why? Amelia shook her head. She'd heard whispers, of course. Society loved to speculate about why eligible men remained unmarried. Some said the Duke was too particular. Others suggested he was still grieving his father. A few more unkind voices hinted at scandal or secret attachments. Because every woman who approaches him sees only the title, the fortune, the connections. They perform for him, Miss Whitmore. They become caricatures of what they think a duchess should be. Margaret's voice carried a weariness that spoke of years of watching her son navigate an impossible social landscape. He's grown cynical, lonely. He goes through the motions of courtship because that's what's expected, but I see his heart closing a little more each season. The raw honesty in Margaret's voice touched something in Amelia. She understood loneliness, understood the particular ache of being surrounded by people yet fundamentally alone. I'm sorry to hear that, Lady Margaret, but I'm not certain why you're telling me this. Margaret studied her for a long moment, her grey eyes seeming to take measure of something deeper than appearances. Because I believe you might be able to help. Both of you, actually. I don't understand. My son needs to meet someone who doesn't know he's a duke, who won't perform or pretend or scheme, someone who will simply be herself. Margaret leaned forward, her intensity making Amelia lean back slightly. And you, Miss Whitmore, need to remember what it feels like to be seen. Not as a spinster or a poor relation or whatever cruel label society has attached to you, but as a woman with thoughts and feelings and worth. Amelia's heart was beating faster now. What exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing an arrangement, a series of meetings between you and my son. But he won't know who you are and you won't know who he is. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Lady Margaret, that's impossible. Everyone knows what the Duke of Thornbury looks like. Everyone in society, perhaps, but you don't move in those circles regularly, do you? You attend events like today's tea, but you're rarely at the balls and soirees where Sebastian appears, and Sebastian spends most of his time managing estates in the north. When was the last time you actually saw him in person? Amelia tried to remember. She'd glimpsed him from a distance at someone's wedding perhaps 3 years ago. Before that? She couldn't recall. The social spheres of dukes and impoverished gentlewomen rarely intersected, and when they did, it was with such brevity that details blurred. I suppose I haven't, but surely someone would recognize him. Or me. This scheme would be discovered immediately. Not if we're careful. Margaret's eyes gleamed with the excitement of a woman planning something delightfully improper. I have a small property in Richmond, a cottage that belonged to my grandmother. It's away from prying eyes, surrounded by gardens. I could arrange for you to meet there. Tell Sebastian I've arranged a meeting with someone who might interest him, a lady of good character who's agreed to meet him anonymously to see if they suit without the complications of courtship. Tell you that a gentleman of good family wishes to make your acquaintance in a similar fashion. And if we discover we don't suit, then you part ways, no harm done. You'll have spent a few pleasant afternoons in conversation, perhaps made a friend. Is that so terrible? It should have been. It should have been scandalous and improper and completely out of the question. But as Amelia sat in that small parlour, she felt something stirring inside her that she'd thought long dead. Curiosity. Hope. The possibility that there might be more to her life than fading into increasingly quiet rooms. The practical part of her mind, the part that had kept her safe and surviving for years, screamed warnings. This was madness. If discovered, it would ruin what little reputation she had. She'd be cast out entirely, left with nothing. But another part of her, the part that remembered being young and full of dreams, whispered that perhaps some risks were worth taking. "Why me?" she asked quietly. Margaret smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "Because in a room full of peacocks you're content to be a sparrow. Because you read actual books instead of just carrying them as accessories. Because I've heard you speak to Lady Hartsworth's companion with the same courtesy you'd show a duchess. Because my son needs someone real, and you, my dear, are the most genuine person I've encountered in years." Amelia felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back quickly. She'd grown so accustomed to being overlooked that genuine praise felt almost painful. It touched parts of herself she'd learned to protect, vulnerabilities she couldn't afford to expose. "What would I need to do?" "Say yes. Meet me at Richmond next Thursday at 2 o'clock. The address is here." Margaret produced a small card from her reticule. "Come in your own carriage or take a cab if you prefer. The cottage is set back from the road. No one will see you arrive." "And your son?" "I'll arrange for him to arrive at 3. You'll have tea, talk, see if you enjoy each other's company. If you do, we'll arrange another meeting. If not—" Margaret shrugged elegantly. "Then we've lost nothing but an afternoon." Amelia took the card, her fingers trembling slightly. The paper felt heavy, weighted with possibility and danger in equal measure. This is madness. The very best things usually are. If we're discovered, we won't be. And even if we were, I'm the one who would bear the brunt of any scandal. You would simply be following the instructions of a somewhat eccentric dowager duchess. Hardly a crime. Amelia looked down at the card in her hand. The address was written in elegant script, each letter formed with care. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Every rational part of her mind was screaming that this was improper, impossible, potentially disastrous. But there was another voice, quieter but more insistent. The voice that remembered being 19 and full of dreams before reality had taught her to settle for less. The voice that whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, there might still be something more waiting for her than quiet resignation. She thought of her small rooms, of the endless succession of teas and gatherings where she was present but invisible. She thought of growing old in that space, year after year of the same careful economies, the same polite invisibility, until she became one of those elderly spinsters who haunted the edges of society like cautionary tales. And she thought of Margaret's words, that she needed to remember what it felt like to be seen. "Thursday at 2 o'clock, she heard herself say. Margaret's smile was brilliant. "Wonderful. And Miss Whitmore? Don't dress to impress. Don't perform. Just be yourself. That's all I ask." They returned to the drawing room separately, Margaret first and then Amelia several minutes later. No one seemed to have noticed their absence. The same conversations continued, the same careful social dancing. Amelia reclaimed her seat and her teacup, but everything felt different now. The same conversations that had seemed so tedious before now barely registered. Her mind was elsewhere, racing forward to Thursday, to Richmond, to a cottage where she would meet a man whose name she wouldn't know. The rest of the tea passed in a blur. Amelia made the appropriate responses, smiled at the appropriate moments, but her thoughts were miles away. When she finally excused herself and stepped out into the cool afternoon air, she felt as though she'd been holding her breath for hours. The walk back to her lodgings took her through familiar streets, past shops where she never stopped because she couldn't afford their wares, past elegant townhouses where families lived in comfort she could barely imagine. London was beautiful in the late afternoon light, all golden stone and deep shadows, but Amelia barely saw it. Mrs. Fletcher was in the front hallway when Amelia arrived, directing a delivery boy carrying parcels. "Ah, Miss Whitmore, did you enjoy your tea?" "Very much, thank you." The lie came easily, but it wasn't entirely a lie. She had enjoyed something about the afternoon, even if it wasn't the tea itself. "There's stew for dinner, if you'd care to join us. Nothing fancy, but plenty of it." That would be lovely. Amelia had learned to accept these invitations graciously. Mrs. Fletcher's kindness was genuine, not charity, and refusing it would have hurt the older woman's feelings. She climbed the narrow stairs to her rooms, unlocked the door and stepped into the space that had been home for the past 6 years. 2 rooms, a sitting room with a small fireplace and a bedroom barely large enough for a bed and wardrobe, but they were hers, paid for with the small income from her grandmother's trust, and that made them precious. Amelia set down her reticule and pulled out the card Margaret had given her. The address stared back at her, innocent and dangerous. She could still change her mind, send a note declining the invitation, claim illness or a prior engagement, return to her safe, quiet, invisible life. But even as she thought it, she knew she wouldn't. Because Margaret had been right, she needed to remember what it felt like to be seen, and if that meant taking a risk, stepping into the unknown, then perhaps it was time to be brave. That evening, Amelia sat by her window and watched the street below. A flower seller was packing up his cart. A young couple walked arm in arm, laughing at some private joke. An elderly man fed scraps to a stray cat, ordinary life flowing around her as it always had. But she felt different, alive in a way she hadn't in years. Thursday felt both impossibly far away and frighteningly close. She had a week to prepare, but how did one prepare for something like this? How did one ready oneself to meet a stranger under false pretenses, to engage in a deception that could unravel everything? Amelia went to bed that night with the card on her bedside table, close enough to touch. And as she drifted towards sleep, she allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, that perhaps Margaret was right. Perhaps there was still possibility waiting for her. Perhaps her story wasn't quite finished yet. The dream that followed was fragmented and strange, full of cottages and tea services and grey eyes that saw past all her careful defences. When she woke the next morning, she couldn't remember the details, but the feeling lingered. Hope. Dangerous, thrilling, terrifying hope. And somewhere across London, in a townhouse far grander than Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house, Sebastian Blackwood was having a similar conversation with his mother, making a similar decision to take a risk on possibility. Neither of them knew yet that this choice would change everything, that what began as an unusual arrangement would become something neither could have predicted. But they would learn. In time, they would both learn exactly what it meant to be truly seen by another person. The story had only just begun. The following Thursday arrived with the same nervous anticipation, but this time Amelia knew what awaited her. She knew the way the light fell through the cottage windows. She knew how Sebastian took his tea, with milk but no sugar. A preference he'd confessed made him seem less sophisticated than he ought to be. She knew the way his expression shifted when something genuinely amused him, a slight widening of his eyes before the smile reached his mouth. What she didn't know was how deeply she'd thought about him in the 7 days between their meetings. The first meeting had been awkward and wonderful in equal measure. They'd circled each other like cautious animals, testing boundaries, searching for safe topics. But somehow, within the space of an afternoon, they'd found a rhythm. Sebastian had asked about her opinions on literature, and she'd answered honestly instead of offering the safe, conventional responses most men expected. He'd listened, truly listened, and then challenged her thinking in ways that made her defend her positions rather than simply accepting his authority. It had been exhilarating, exhausting, completely unlike any conversation she'd had in years. Margaret had been waiting at the cottage again, her expression knowing in a way that made Amelia feel transparent. "He arrived early," she'd whispered as Amelia stepped through the door. "Been pacing the garden for 20 minutes like a schoolboy." That image, Sebastian, nervous, uncertain, pacing, had done something to Amelia's carefully guarded heart. She'd spent so long assuming that men like him existed in a different realm entirely, untouched by the mundane anxieties that plagued ordinary people. But he was nervous. For her, for this. The knowledge settled into her chest like a small flame, warming places that had been cold for too long. When she entered the parlor, he stood quickly, nearly knocking over a small table in his haste. The clatter of porcelain made them both freeze, then laugh, that shared embarrassment that somehow broke the tension more effectively than any careful greeting could have. "Miss Smith, I'm glad you came back." "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I wasn't certain. I thought perhaps—" He trailed off, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she was beginning to recognize as habit. It made him look younger, more vulnerable. "I thought perhaps I'd talked too much last week. I tend to do that when I'm comfortable with someone." Comfortable. The word settled around her like a warm shawl. In all her years of social interaction, no one had ever described time with her as comfortable. Tolerable, perhaps. Pleasant enough. But comfortable suggested ease, a lack of pretense, the ability to simply be without constant performance. "I found your conversation refreshing," Amelia said carefully. "Most people talk at you rather than with you." "Exactly." His face brightened, that transformation she was learning to watch for. "That's exactly it. I've always felt like I'm playing a role in a theatrical production where everyone else knows their lines, and I'm still trying to find the script." They settled into the same chairs as before, a kind of unspoken agreement that this was their space now. The chairs faced each other across a small table, close enough for intimate conversation, but respecting enough distance to maintain propriety. Margaret had left them a different tea service this time, Darjeeling instead of Earl Grey, with small lemon cakes that melted on the tongue. Amelia noticed these details, cataloguing them like treasures. The way Sebastian's coat was well-tailored but not ostentatious. The small scar on his left hand that spoke of some past injury. The way he poured tea with careful attention, as though the ritual mattered. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," Sebastian said suddenly. Amelia blinked. "That's rather forward." "I know, but we have this unusual opportunity, don't we? To be honest without consequence. When else will we have that chance?" He leaned forward slightly. "I spent all week thinking about our last conversation, about how rare it is to speak freely, to say what you actually think rather than what's expected. I don't want to waste our time together on safe platitudes." He was right, of course. In the normal course of things, courtship was a dance of careful revelation, each fact shared only after proper assessment of risk. But this wasn't courtship. This was something else entirely, an experiment in honesty, a chance to be fully themselves without the weight of consequence. "I wanted to be a teacher," Amelia heard herself say, "when I was young, before my father died, and our circumstances changed. I loved learning, and I thought perhaps I could help others discover that same joy. I used to imagine a classroom full of girls, teaching them not just accomplishments but actual knowledge. Philosophy, mathematics, history that went beyond memorizing dates." She paused, surprised by how much the old dream still hurt. "But it wasn't practical. Women in my position become governesses or companions, not teachers in their own right." Sebastian was quiet for a moment, and she worried she'd revealed too much, exposed too much disappointment. But when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than dismissive. "That's a loss," he said finally, "for all the students you might have had. You have a way of explaining things that makes them clear without being condescending. I noticed it last week when you were talking about the book you'd been reading. The observation touched her more than it should have. Most people, when she mentioned books, changed the subject quickly. Reading was acceptable for women, but discussing ideas with genuine engagement was considered unbecoming. Sebastian not only remembered her comments, but had apparently thought about them enough to form opinions. "Your turn," Amelia said. "My turn? Tell me something you've never told anyone." He laughed, but there was little humor in it. "I hate being a duke." The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward. Amelia waited, sensing there was more. She'd learned over the years that silence often drew out truth more effectively than questions. Not the responsibility, Sebastian continued, staring into his teacup as though it might offer answers. I don't mind the estate management or the tenants or the business aspects. I find those challenging in a good way. There's satisfaction in solving problems, in making improvements that benefit people's lives. He looked up, meeting her eyes. But the rest of it, the constant performance, the way people change when they're around me, the women who look at me and see nothing but a title and a fortune. He set down his cup with careful precision, as though the simple action required all his concentration. Sometimes I fantasize about walking away from it all, becoming someone ordinary, free. I imagine what it would be like to walk into a room and have people respond to me rather than to my title, to make friends based on shared interests rather than social advantage, to find someone who... He trailed off. Who sees you, Amelia finished softly. Yes, exactly that. His expression held surprise and relief in equal measure. How did you know? Because I understand invisibility, just from the opposite direction. She chose her words carefully. You're too visible. I'm not visible enough. But the result is the same. Neither of us gets to be simply ourselves. The understanding that passed between them in that moment felt profound, a recognition that went beyond words. They were two people on opposite ends of society's spectrum, both isolated in different ways, both longing for the same thing, to be known, truly known by another person. Tell me about your father, Amelia said, sensing he needed to move to safer ground. Sebastian's expression shifted, grief and love mingling in his features. He was remarkable, stern, but fair. He believed in duty above all else, but he also believed in kindness. He used to walk the estate every morning, talking to the farmers, checking on families. He knew everyone's name, everyone's story. A smile ghosted across his face. I remember following him when I was 6 or 7, trying to match his stride. He'd slow down for me but pretend he wasn't, maintaining the fiction that I was keeping up on my own. He taught me that true authority comes from service, not from demanding obedience. He sounds wonderful. He was, but he was also trapped by duty in ways I didn't understand until after his death. He married my mother because it was an advantageous match. Good families, compatible fortunes, all the practical considerations. They grew fond of each other over the years, developed a partnership that worked well enough. But I don't think... Sebastian paused, searching for words. I don't think either of them ever experienced the kind of love poets write about. The consuming, irrational, choose you above all else kind of love. Maybe that kind of love is just poetry, Amelia suggested, a beautiful fiction that real life can't sustain. Do you believe that? She thought about it seriously. I want to believe otherwise, but practical experience suggests that most marriages are built on compatibility and mutual benefit rather than passion. Perhaps that's not such a terrible foundation. Perhaps. Sebastian didn't sound convinced. But when I was young, I thought he was immortal, invincible. His death was sudden, a riding accident. One moment he was there, solid and constant, and the next... He swallowed hard. I was 28, arrogant, still half convinced I had time to become the man he wanted me to be. Instead, I had to become that man overnight. The weight in his voice made Amelia's chest ache. I'm sorry. Losing a parent is... She trailed off, remembering her own father's death, the way the world had tilted and never quite righted itself. There are no adequate words, are there? No. People offer condolences, but they're just sounds, rituals we perform because silence feels wrong. He looked at her directly. But somehow I think you actually understand. Not just the proper sympathetic responses, but the real grief underneath. My father died when I was 18. Heart seizure. He was there at breakfast complaining about the newspaper and dead before dinner. My mother... Amelia's voice caught. She never recovered, not really. She went through the motions for 6 more years, but part of her died with him. They sat in shared understanding of loss, of worlds that had shifted beneath their feet and never stabilized again. This wasn't the careful, distant conversation of courtship. This was real, raw and honest and vulnerable. in ways that should have been frightening but somehow felt right. The vulnerability in his confession moved something in Amelia. Here was a man who had everything society valued, and yet he carried the same doubts, the same fears that she did. It made him human in a way she hadn't expected, breaking down the careful categories she'd used to organize her world into people like her and people like him. "I think," she said carefully, "that the fact you're asking whether you've succeeded in becoming the man your father wanted means you're already succeeding. Truly arrogant men never doubt themselves." Is that wisdom or comfort? Can't it be both? His smile was genuine this time, reaching his eyes and transforming his entire face. I suppose it can. They talked for hours again, the afternoon disappearing as completely as the first time. But this conversation went deeper, reaching into territories they hadn't dared explore before. Sebastian spoke of the loneliness of his position, how he was surrounded by people, yet perpetually isolated. Every interaction was filtered through his title, every friendship suspect because of the advantages he could provide. Amelia shared the peculiar invisibility of her existence, how she'd learned to move through social spaces like a ghost. She described the careful calculations required to maintain respectability on limited means, the constant awareness of being one misstep away from complete social exile. She talked about the young woman she'd been, full of dreams and ambitions, and the gradual erosion of those dreams as reality imposed its limits. "Do you ever get angry about it?" Sebastian asked. "The way society treats you?" Amelia considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. But anger requires energy, and I learned long ago to conserve mine for survival rather than rage. Though I confess there are moments when I watch young girls flirt and scheme, secure in their beauty and dowries, and I feel," she searched for the right word, "cheated, as though I missed some crucial lesson about how to be the kind of woman people want." "Maybe you didn't miss the lesson. Maybe you simply refuse to become someone you're not." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither dared name. Amelia felt her breath catch, felt the careful distance she'd been maintaining begin to crumble. "Walk with me," Sebastian said suddenly, standing. "The gardens are beautiful this time of year, even in autumn. We shouldn't waste the afternoon light." They moved outside together, following gravel paths between rose bushes that had finished blooming but still held structural beauty. The bare branches created intricate patterns against the sky, and the air carried that particular autumn smell of decay and preparation, endings and beginnings mixed together. Sebastian offered his arm without thinking, and Amelia took it with equal naturalness. The contact felt both significant and comfortable, his warmth bleeding through layers of fabric to where her hand rested in the crook of his elbow. "This place belonged to my grandmother," Sebastian said as they walked. "My mother's mother. She was apparently quite scandalous in her youth, ran off with a younger son much to her family's horror. They were blissfully happy until he died young, leaving her widowed at 30. "That's heartbreaking." "Yes, but my mother says she never regretted choosing love over practicality. She used to say that 1 year of genuine happiness was worth more than a lifetime of comfortable misery." He slowed their pace, as though reluctant to reach the end of the path. This cottage was her retreat after his death, a place where she could remember him without the weight of family disapproval. "My mother inherited it, and has kept it much as her mother left it." Amelia heard the subtext in his words, the questions he was asking without quite asking them. The cottage wasn't just a neutral meeting place, it was a shrine to choosing love over duty, to valuing authentic connection above social advantage. "Do you believe that?" she asked. "That 1 year of happiness is worth a lifetime of comfortable misery." "I want to, but it's easy to romanticize choices when you're not the one who has to live with the consequences." He stopped walking, turning to face her. The afternoon sun was behind him, making it difficult to see his expression clearly, but his voice carried such earnest hope that Amelia felt her carefully constructed defenses beginning to crack. "What do you believe, Miss Smith?" The autumn sun created a halo around him, making him seem almost otherworldly, but his question was entirely earthbound, asking her to be honest in ways that felt dangerous. "I believe," she said slowly, choosing each word with care, "that happiness is rarer than we're led to expect. Most of life is simply endurance, making the best of circumstances beyond our control. We tell ourselves stories about grand passions and transformative love, but mostly we're just trying to survive with some measure of dignity intact. She paused, gathering courage. But when something real comes along, something genuine, perhaps we owe it to ourselves to reach for it, even knowing it might slip through our fingers. Because a life lived entirely in safety might be a life not fully lived at all. And if reaching for it means risking everything, then we have to decide what everything means: security, reputation, approval. She met his gaze directly, feeling reckless and brave, or the possibility of knowing what it feels like to be truly alive. They stood there in the fading afternoon light, two people who had come to this cottage expecting nothing and finding something neither had names for yet. The air between them felt charged, dangerous, full of unspoken possibilities that threatened to overflow into words that couldn't be taken back. Sebastian reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wished. His hand touched her cheek, just the lightest brush of fingertips against skin. The contact sent electricity through her entire body, every nerve suddenly awake and singing. "I find myself thinking about you constantly," he whispered. "Between our meetings, I rehearse conversations I want to have with you. I notice things I want to tell you about. A particularly beautiful sunset, an argument in a book, the way frost forms patterns on windows. It's maddening and wonderful and completely unexpected." Amelia's heart was racing so fast she thought it might burst from her chest. "I know. I feel it too." The admission cost her something. She'd spent so long protecting herself, maintaining careful emotional distance, that honesty felt like standing naked in a snowstorm. But it was also liberating, stripping away pretense to reveal the vulnerable truth underneath. "What are we doing, Miss Smith?" "I don't know, but I'm not ready for it to stop." He stepped back, dropping his hand, and she felt the loss of contact like cold water shocking her system. "We should go back inside. It's getting late and my mother will worry if I don't return soon." They walked back in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people processing something profound, something that required quiet to fully understand. The gravel crunched under their feet, marking each step back toward the cottage, and the inevitable moment when they'd have to separate again. Inside, they found Margaret waiting with a knowing smile and fresh tea. Her eyes moved between them, taking in flushed cheeks and careful distance, reading the story written in body language and unspoken tension. "Did you enjoy the gardens?" "Very much," Sebastian replied, and Amelia heard the layers in his simple answer. They'd enjoyed more than gardens. They'd crossed some invisible threshold into territory neither had anticipated. Margaret looked between them, her expression softening with something that might have been satisfaction or might have been concern. "I'm glad. Will you both return next Thursday?" Amelia and Sebastian exchanged glances, a whole conversation happening in that single look. Questions and hopes and fears all tangled together, asking and answering without words. "Yes," they said in unison, then laughed at the coincidence, the sound breaking some of the tension and restoring a measure of ease. "Wonderful." Margaret busied herself with teacups, giving them space for goodbye, while still maintaining her role as chaperone. Same time, then. The carriage ride home felt longer than usual. Amelia sat in the darkening cab, watching London emerge around her as they returned from Richmond. The city was lighting up for evening, windows glowing warm against the gathering dark. People hurried home from work, from shopping, from whatever activities filled their days. She was one of them, and not one of them. She had a secret now, something precious and dangerous that she carried in her chest like stolen treasure. Every Thursday was becoming a lifeline, pulling her out of the grey sameness of her daily existence into something vivid and vital. Mrs. Fletcher was waiting when she arrived, curiosity bright in her eyes. "You've been gone most of the day, dear. Pleasant outing?" "Very pleasant, thank you." Amelia kept her voice neutral, but something in her expression must have given her away, because Mrs. Fletcher's eyebrows rose. "I see. Well, there's cold ham and bread in the kitchen if you're hungry." "Thank you. I think I'll just go up to my rooms." She climbed the narrow stairs, each step feeling heavier than usual, weighted with all the things she was thinking and feeling but couldn't speak aloud. In the safety of her sitting room, she finally let herself collapse into her chair and simply feel everything she'd been holding at bay. She was falling in love with him. There was no other word for this consuming awareness, this constant preoccupation with someone else's thoughts and feelings. She thought about him when she should have been sleeping. She composed conversations in her mind during the endless dull hours of her daily routine. She caught herself smiling at random moments, remembering something he'd said, or the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. It was wonderful and terrible in equal measure, because even as she fell deeper into this feeling, she knew it couldn't last. Eventually, they would have to return to their real lives, and this borrowed time would become nothing but memory. Over the following weeks, the Thursday meetings became the axis around which Amelia's life turned. Everything else was simply marking time until she could return to the cottage, to Sebastian, to the version of herself she became in his presence. They talked about everything and nothing. Books they'd read, places they wanted to visit, childhood memories that shaped who they'd become. Sebastian told her about learning to manage the estate, the mistakes he'd made, and the lessons they'd taught him. He described the delicate balance of maintaining tradition while implementing necessary changes, of respecting the past while preparing for the future. Amelia shared her love of languages, how she'd taught herself French and Italian through borrowed books and sheer determination. She described the joy of encountering a new word, of understanding grammatical structures that revealed different ways of organizing thought and experience. "You would have made an extraordinary teacher," he said one afternoon, and the admiration in his voice made her feel seen in a way she'd never experienced. Not pitied, not patronized, simply valued for who she was and what she might have been. They were careful never to reveal too much about their real circumstances. No names beyond the aliases Margaret had provided. No specific addresses or detailed descriptions of their daily lives. It was a game and a shield, protecting them from the inevitable moment when reality would intrude. But with each meeting, the pretense became harder to maintain. How could she not notice the quality of his clothing, subtle but unmistakable? The way he spoke about responsibility suggested wealth and consequence far beyond ordinary circumstances. How could he not observe her careful economies, the way she mended her gloves rather than buying new ones, the slight wear at the hem of her best dress? They were playing a game with increasingly transparent rules, both pretending not to see what was becoming obvious, and yet neither of them was quite ready to break the spell, to introduce reality into this carefully constructed fantasy. The sixth Thursday brought rain, heavy drops that drummed against the cottage windows and created a cocoon of intimacy inside. The weather felt appropriate somehow, matching the intensity of what was building between them. They'd moved their chairs closer to the fire, tea forgotten on the table behind them as they talked. "Tell me something that scares you," Amelia said. They'd developed this habit of trading confessions, each revelation drawing them deeper into understanding. Sebastian was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. The firelight played across his features, casting shadows that made him look both younger and older simultaneously. "Becoming my father. I thought you admired him. I did. I do. But he sacrificed everything for duty. His happiness, his desires, perhaps even his capacity for joy. He married my mother because it was an advantageous match, and while they grew to care for each other, I don't think they ever truly loved each other. Not the way—" He stopped, glancing at her. "Not the way people should. And you're afraid you'll do the same." "I'm afraid I won't have a choice. My position requires certain things: an advantageous marriage, an heir, maintaining the family reputation and fortune. Sometimes I lie awake at night, watching my future unspool before me like a script already written, and I feel like I'm suffocating." The raw honesty in his voice made Amelia's chest ache. She understood that feeling better than he knew, that sense of being trapped in a life that had been decided by forces beyond one's control. "Your turn to ask me something. What do you dream about? When you imagine a future where anything is possible, what do you see?" She'd never let herself dream like that, not really. Dreams were dangerous when reality offered so little hope. They created longings that couldn't be fulfilled, opened wounds that never quite healed. But here, in this cottage, with this man, she felt brave enough to be honest. A home, she said softly. Not grand, just comfortable. Books everywhere. Shelves in every room, piles on tables. That lived-in feeling of a space dedicated to ideas and conversation. A garden where I could grow flowers, getting my hands dirty without worrying about being seen as unladylike. She paused, gathering courage. Someone to talk to in the evenings. Someone who actually cares what I think, rather than simply tolerating my presence. Walking together after dinner, discussing what we've read or thought about during the day. The kind of partnership where silence is comfortable because you don't need to fill every moment with performance. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Someone who sees me. I see you. The words were barely audible over the crackling fire and drumming rain, but they landed with the force of a shout. Amelia looked up to find Sebastian watching her with such intensity that she couldn't breathe. Miss Smith? Don't. She held up a hand, stopping him before he could say whatever was coming next. Whatever you're about to say, please don't, because I think we both know that this, she gestured between them, is temporary. We're living in a borrowed moment. Eventually we'll have to return to our real lives, and this will become a memory. A lovely one, but still just a memory. What if it doesn't have to be? The question hung in the air between them, impossible and tempting. Amelia felt tears threatening and blinked them back furiously. It does. We both know it does. Sebastian stood abruptly, pacing to the window where rain streaked the glass in rivulets that distorted the garden beyond. His shoulders were tense, his entire body radiating frustration and something else. Determination, perhaps, or desperation. My mother arranged these meetings. She told me she wanted me to meet someone genuine, someone who would see me as more than a title. But she wouldn't do that without a reason. He turned to face her, and she was startled by the fierceness in his expression. She's not a romantic fool arranging casual encounters for my amusement. She's planning something more permanent. Amelia's heart sank even as hope tried to flare. That's impossible. You don't even know who I really am. Don't I? He crossed back to her, kneeling beside her chair so they were eye level. I know you're kind and intelligent and brave in ways you don't recognize. I know you read voraciously and think deeply and care about things beyond surface appearances. I know that talking to you makes me feel more myself than I've felt in years. He took her hands in his grip warm and solid. I know that I'm falling in love with you, and I don't even know your real name. The words hung in the air between them, impossible and perfect and terrifying. Amelia felt as though she was standing at the edge of a cliff, teetering between falling and flying. You can't love me, she whispered. You don't know me. Not really. You don't know where I come from or what I am, or how impossible this entire situation is. Then tell me who you are. Let me know all of you, not just the parts you've chosen to reveal in this cottage. His voice was urgent now, pleading. Give me the chance to love the real you instead of this careful version you present. She wanted to. Every fiber of her being wanted to confess everything, to step out from behind the alias and reveal herself completely, to take the risk and trust that what they'd built together was strong enough to survive the truth. But fear held her back. Fear of his reaction when he learned she was nobody. Fear of watching his expression change from love to pity to disappointment. Fear of losing this fragile, precious thing they'd created together. I can't, she said, and the words tasted like ashes. Not yet. Please, Sebastian, not yet. He stood, moving back to the window, and she could see the tension in every line of his body. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, but she heard the hurt underneath. How long then? How long are we going to hide behind these false names and careful omissions? How long before we're brave enough to be honest with each other? I don't know, but I'm not ready for this to end. Are you? The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire about to snap. Rain continued its relentless drumming, creating a rhythm that seemed to match Amelia's racing heartbeat. Finally, Sebastian shook his head, his reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked window. No, I'm not ready either. But something had shifted between them. The pretense that had felt playful before now felt suffocating. The anonymity that had protected them now felt like a barrier they'd have to breach or be forever separated by. They left the cottage separately that day, the rain having eased to a gentle mist that hung in the air like uncertainty made visible. Amelia sat in her hired cab, watching the countryside roll past, and felt something fundamental shifting inside her. She was in love with him. There was no denying it anymore, no protecting herself with careful emotional distance. She'd tried to maintain walls, to remember that this was temporary, but it was useless. She loved Sebastian Blackwood, or rather, she loved the man she knew as Mr. Blackwood, the man who existed in that cottage free from the weight of his title. The question was what to do about it. The following days passed in a fog of indecision. Amelia went through her usual routines, attending the occasional tea, managing her meager accounts, reading in her small rooms, but her mind was always elsewhere. She composed and discarded a dozen letters to Sebastian, trying to find words for feelings that seemed too large for language. Margaret was waiting for her the following Thursday, alone in the cottage parlour. The absence of Sebastian hit Amelia like a physical blow, even though she'd been half expecting it. "Sebastian won't be coming today," Margaret said without preamble. "He asked me to give you this." She handed Amelia a letter, sealed with plain wax that bore no identifying marks. Amelia took it with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of what it might contain. She broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was strong and clear, each letter formed with care. "Miss Smith, forgive my absence today. I needed time to think, to consider what we've been doing and what it means. These weeks with you have been the happiest I've known in years, but I realize we can't continue indefinitely in this liminal space between truth and pretense. I want to know you fully, not just the parts you've chosen to reveal, but all of you, your real name, your real life, the circumstances that brought you to my mother's attention, everything you've been holding back out of fear or propriety or whatever walls you've built to protect yourself. I'm willing to go first. I'm willing to tell you everything about who I really am, even knowing you might walk away once you know the truth. But I need you to promise me the same honesty in return. If you're willing to take that risk, meet me here next Thursday at our usual time. If not, I'll understand. I'll treasure these weeks we've had and wish you every happiness. But I can't continue building something real on a foundation of careful omissions and false names. Please come. Please give us a chance at something real. Yours, Sebastian." Amelia read the letter 3 times, each word sinking deeper into her consciousness. He was offering her everything she wanted and everything she feared. The truth would free them or destroy them, and there was no way to know which until it happened. Margaret watched her with knowing eyes, patient in the way only someone who'd lived long enough to understand timing could be. "What will you do?" Amelia folded the letter carefully, pressing it against her heart as though she could absorb his words through proximity. "I don't know yet, but I have a week to decide." She left the cottage in turmoil, her mind spinning through possibilities like a wheel that couldn't find purchase. She could walk away now, protect herself from inevitable heartbreak, keep what they'd had as a perfect memory, untainted by the messiness of reality. Or she could take the risk, step into the unknown, and trust that what they'd built together was strong enough to survive the truth. 7 days to choose between safety and possibility. 7 days to decide whether love was worth the risk of losing everything. The weight of the decision followed her home, settled into her small rooms, kept her awake through long nights of wrestling with hope and fear in equal measure. The week that followed Sebastian's letter was the longest of Amelia's life. She carried it with her everywhere, folded carefully in her reticule, reading it so many times that she could recite every word from memory. Each reading brought a fresh wave of fear and hope, the two emotions tangling together until she couldn't separate one from the other. The letter had become a talisman of sorts, physical proof that what she'd experienced wasn't simply her imagination, that someone remarkable, had seen her and found her worthy of knowing. But it was also a demand, asking her to be braver than she'd ever been, to risk the careful safety she'd built around herself. Monday passed in a haze of indecision. Amelia attended a small gathering at Lady Hartsworth's, sitting in her usual corner, invisible as always. But this time the invisibility chafed. She found herself noticing how the other women talked around her rather than to her, how conversations shifted when she approached. Had it always been this way? Or had these weeks with Sebastian taught her to expect more, to hunger for the kind of genuine connection they'd shared? Tuesday afternoon found her walking through Hyde Park, seeking clarity and movement. The autumn air had turned sharp with the promise of winter, and most of the fashionable crowd had retreated to warmer drawing rooms. She was grateful for the relative solitude, for the space to think without the constant press of society's expectations. The park in autumn had its own beauty, trees stripped bare, creating intricate patterns against grey skies. There was honesty in it, she thought. No pretense of perpetual spring, no hiding the reality of seasons changing and time passing. Everything laid bare for anyone willing to look. Miss Whitmore, what a delightful surprise. Amelia turned to find Lady Margaret approaching, wrapped in a burgundy cloak that made her look regal despite the informal setting. Her presence here couldn't be coincidence. Margaret was too deliberate for chance encounters. Lady Margaret, Amelia curtsied, her mind racing. Had Sebastian told his mother about the letter? Did Margaret know about his confession of love, about the ultimatum he'd issued? "Walk with me," Margaret said, taking Amelia's arm with the easy authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We should talk." They walked in silence for several minutes, following a path that wound between bare trees. Other walkers passed occasionally. A nursemaid with children, an elderly gentleman feeding ducks at the pond, a young couple stealing glances when they thought no one was watching. All of them going about their ordinary lives, while Amelia's world teetered on the edge of transformation. Finally, Margaret spoke. "He's in agony, you know. My son. He barely sleeps, barely eats. He paces the house like a caged animal, and when I ask what's troubling him, he claims it's a state business." She glanced at Amelia, her grey eyes seeing too much. But a mother knows when her child is suffering from matters of the heart. "Lady Margaret, Let me finish." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "I arranged these meetings because I wanted Sebastian to experience genuine connection, untainted by his title. I wanted him to remember what it felt like to be simply a man, not a duke. And I wanted you to remember what it felt like to be valued for who you are, not dismissed for what you lack." Amelia felt tears prick her eyes. The simple acknowledgement of her invisibility, spoken aloud by someone who saw her clearly, was almost unbearable in its kindness. "You've given me an extraordinary gift," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "These weeks have been... I can't adequately express what they've meant to me. But you're afraid." Terrified. Margaret stopped walking, turning to face her directly. The Dowager Duchess's expression held understanding, but also a challenge. "Of what specifically? That he'll reject you once he knows you're not wealthy or titled, or that he won't, and you'll have to navigate a world you've never been part of?" The question struck at the heart of Amelia's turmoil. She'd spent the entire week trying to untangle exactly what frightened her, and Margaret had identified both fears with surgical precision. Both either, all of it. She took a shaky breath, trying to organize thoughts that felt like scattered leaves in wind. "When I'm with him in that cottage, I can almost believe that I'm enough, that who I am matters more than what I have. But out here, in the real world, I'm confronted with reality. I'm 32, poor, and utterly unsuitable for a man in his position. Even if he wanted me, his duty would require him to choose someone else. Perhaps, or perhaps duty and desire can align." Margaret squeezed her arm. "But you'll never know unless you're brave enough to find out. And Miss Whitmore, I've watched you for months now. You are many things, but a coward is not one of them." "I don't feel brave. I feel terrified and small and completely out of my depth." "That's what bravery is, child. Not the absence of fear, but acting despite it." Margaret's voice softened. "You've survived losing your parents. You've maintained your dignity and grace while navigating circumstances that would have broken lesser women. You've carved out a life for yourself with nothing but determination and intelligence. That's courage of the highest order." Amelia hadn't thought of her survival in those terms. She'd simply done what was necessary day after day because the alternative was giving up entirely. But hearing Margaret frame it as bravery rather than mere endurance shifted something in her perception. What if I tell him the truth and he realizes I'm not who he thought I was? Then he's a fool and you're better off knowing it now rather than later. Margaret's tone was matter of fact. But I don't think that will happen. My son sees people, truly sees them, in ways that most don't. He wouldn't have fallen in love with a fantasy. He fell in love with you, the real you that you've been revealing piece by piece in those Thursday meetings. Fallen in love. Hearing someone else say it made it real in a way that Sebastian's letter hadn't quite accomplished. This wasn't just wishful thinking or misread signals. He loved her. The Duke of Thornbury loved Amelia Whitmore, a nobody from nowhere with nothing to offer but herself. "I'm afraid," Amelia whispered. "Of course you are. Love is terrifying precisely because it matters so much." Margaret resumed walking, pulling Amelia along. "But let me tell you something about fear. It's often a compass pointing toward what we want most. We don't fear losing things we don't care about. Your fear means this matters to you, which means it's worth fighting for." They walked in silence for several more minutes, Amelia processing Margaret's words. The older woman was right, of course. She wouldn't feel this torn if Sebastian meant nothing to her. The intensity of her fear was directly proportional to how much she'd come to care for him, to hope for a future that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. "I have to tell you something," Margaret said as they neared the park gates. "About your family. I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I did some research." Amelia's stomach tightened. "Research?" "Nothing invasive. Simply tracing family connections, the sort of thing any mother would do before encouraging her son toward a particular young woman." Margaret pulled a folded paper from her cloak pocket. "Your grandfather was Sir Thomas Whitmore, a baronet. Your grandmother was Lady Catherine Pemberton before her marriage, daughter of the Earl of Fairmont, both respected families, even if their fortunes have waned." Amelia stared at the paper detailing genealogy she'd always known, but never thought mattered. "I'm aware of my family history, Lady Margaret, but titles without fortune mean very little in our world. Perhaps, but they mean you're not the nobody you've convinced yourself you are. You have connections, respectability, a family name that still carries weight in certain circles." Margaret pressed the paper into her hand. "You simply haven't had anyone to champion your cause, to remind society that you exist and deserve consideration." "You researched my family," Amelia said slowly, the implications sinking in. "Before you arranged these meetings, you knew who I was." "Of course. I needed to know who I was introducing to my son." Margaret's expression turned gentle. "But I want you to understand something, Amelia. Even if you'd had no family connections at all, even if you'd been born in a gutter with no name and no history, I would still have chosen you. Because you're exactly what Sebastian needs. Someone real, someone kind, someone brave enough to love him for himself rather than his title." The words broke something open in Amelia's chest, a dam she hadn't realized she'd built. Tears spilled down her cheeks and she didn't bother wiping them away. "Why?" she asked. "Why me? Why go to all this trouble for someone like me?" "Because I watched you for months, seeing how you carried yourself with grace, despite difficult circumstances. Because I heard you speak to servants with genuine kindness. Because I saw you in Hatchards, spending money you couldn't afford on books that would feed your mind." Margaret smiled. "And because my son has been lonely for too long, and you looked like someone who understood loneliness from the inside out." They parted shortly after, but Margaret's words echoed in Amelia's mind for the rest of the week. She spent Wednesday evening writing and discarding letters to Sebastian, trying to explain feelings she barely understood herself. Each attempt felt inadequate, too formal or too emotional, saying too much or not enough. Finally, exhausted by the effort, she gave up and simply wrote, "I'll be there Thursday. Whatever happens, I'll be there." She sealed it and arranged for delivery to Margaret, trusting the Dowager Duchess to ensure it reached her son. Then she sat in her small rooms, watching evening deepen into night, and tried to prepare herself for whatever was coming. Thursday morning arrived with crystalline clarity, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to mock Amelia's nervous uncertainty. She woke before dawn, unable to sleep, her mind already racing ahead to the afternoon's meeting. This was it. The moment of truth. The end of pretense, and the beginning of something real, whatever that might look like. She dressed with painstaking care, choosing a gown in deep emerald that had been her finest dress before poverty had narrowed her wardrobe. The color brought out the blue in her eyes and complemented her dark hair. She pinned her hair up, then down, then up again, finally settling on a simple style that framed her face without pretension. The woman staring back at her from the small mirror was almost a stranger. There was fear in her eyes, yes, but also determination. Hope. The knowledge that she was about to step off a cliff and trust that something would catch her. Mrs. Fletcher caught her in the hallway as she was leaving. "My, don't you look lovely? Special occasion?" "Just tea," Amelia said, which wasn't exactly a lie, but wasn't the whole truth either. Everything about the past weeks had existed in that liminal space between honesty and deception. "Well, you enjoy yourself. You've seemed different lately, dear. Happier." Mrs. Fletcher's smile was warm. "It's good to see some color in your cheeks." The journey to Richmond passed in a blur of nervous anticipation and rehearsed conversations. Amelia barely registered the familiar landmarks, her mind consumed with what she would say when she saw him. How would she explain her deception, her willingness to hide behind an alias while demanding honesty from him? Would he understand, or would he see it as the manipulation some would surely claim it was? The cottage appeared through the trees like something from a dream, exactly as it had every Thursday for weeks now. But today felt different, final somehow, as though whatever happened in the next few hours would set the course for the rest of her life. For a moment, Amelia simply sat in the hired cab, staring at the place where her life had changed without her quite realizing it. The gardens were stark in their late autumn bareness, but still beautiful. Honest. No pretense of perpetual bloom, just the reality of seasons changing. She paid the driver and walked up the path to the door, each step feeling both inevitable and impossible. Margaret answered, but her expression was different this time, less knowing, more anxious. Lines of worry creased her forehead, and her usual confidence seemed slightly shaken. "He's in the garden," she said quietly. "He's been there since dawn, walking circles and rehearsing what he wants to say." The image of Sebastian, nervous, pacing, preparing for this conversation with the same anxiety she felt, steadied Amelia somehow. They were both scared, both taking a risk, both hoping for something neither dared fully articulate. Margaret touched Amelia's hand briefly. "Whatever happens today, I want you to know that I meant what I said. You're remarkable and you deserve happiness. Even if—" She paused. "Even if this doesn't work out as we hoped, you deserve to be seen and valued." "Thank you," Amelia whispered, her throat tight with emotion. She found him by the fountain, staring into the water as though it might offer answers. He dressed simply but well, and even from behind she could see the tension in his shoulders. The way he held himself spoke of someone braced for impact, hoping for the best but preparing for the worst. He must have heard her footsteps on the gravel, because he turned, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. Relief, joy, terror, all of it flickering across his features in rapid succession, like emotions too large to contain. "You came," he said, and his voice carried such vulnerable hope that Amelia felt tears threatening already. "I promised I would." They stood there, separated by perhaps 10 feet of garden path that might as well have been an ocean. Neither seemed certain how to bridge the distance, how to begin a conversation that would change everything. The autumn sun was brilliant but cold, creating sharp shadows and highlighting every detail with painful clarity. Amelia could see the fine lines around Sebastian's eyes, evidence of worry or sleepless nights, could see the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, nervous energy seeking release. "I should go first," Sebastian said finally, his voice steadier now that he'd committed to speaking. "I proposed this honesty, so it's only fair that I begin." He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as though preparing for battle. "My name is Sebastian Blackwood. I'm the Duke of Thornbury. I inherited the title 7 years ago when my father died. I manage estates across 3 counties, sit in the House of Lords, and carry the weight of a family legacy that stretches back centuries. I'm 35 years old, unmarried, and considered an excellent match by every ambitious mother in London." He paused, watching her face for reaction. Amelia kept her expression carefully neutral, even though her heart was racing. This was the moment, the truth that would change everything. "I have a fortune that includes properties, investments, and responsibilities I didn't ask for but accept as my duty. I have power and influence that come with the title whether I want them or not. I have expectations placed on me from every direction, from family, from society, from history itself." His voice took on an edge of frustration. "And until I met you, I was suffocating under all of it." He stepped closer, closing some of the distance between them. "I agreed to these meetings because my mother was worried about me. She saw how isolated I'd become, how cynical about the possibility of genuine connection. Every woman I met saw only the title, the fortune, the social advantage I could provide. I was suffocating under the weight of it all." Another step. They were only a few feet apart now. Amelia could see the hope and fear warring in his grey eyes, could see how much this confession was costing him. "And then I met you," Sebastian continued, his voice softening. "In that cottage, away from the performance of society, I found something I'd stopped believing existed. Someone who laughed at my jokes because they were actually funny, not because I was a duke. Someone who challenged my opinions and made me defend my reasoning. Someone who made me feel like simply being myself was enough." He took another step, close enough now that Amelia could have reached out and touched him. "I love you," Sebastian said, and the words carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I love your intelligence and your kindness, and the way you see through pretense to truth. I love that you read philosophy for pleasure and can argue about poetry, like others argue about weather. I love your laugh when something genuinely delights you and the way you tilt your head when you're considering a new idea." He swallowed hard, vulnerability written across every feature. "And I desperately hope that when you tell me who you really are, I'll still have the right to love you. That whatever circumstances brought you to my mother's attention, whatever reasons you had for agreeing to these meetings, won't change what we've built together." Silence fell between them, broken only by the gentle splash of the fountain and the distant cry of a bird. Amelia felt as though she was standing at a crossroads with every possible future branching out before her. She could lie, invent a respectable background, claim connections she didn't have, present herself as someone more suitable for a duke, or she could be brave, trust that what they'd built together was strong enough to survive truth. The moment stretched, time seeming to slow, as Amelia gathered every scrap of courage she possessed. She thought of Margaret's words about fear being a compass pointing toward what mattered most. She thought of all the years she'd spent being invisible, protecting herself by never risking rejection. And she thought of Sebastian's face when he'd said he loved her, the absolute certainty in his voice. "My name is Amelia Whitmore," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "I'm 32 years old, unmarried, and not likely to be otherwise. I have no title, no fortune, and no family connections worth mentioning. My father was a gentleman of modest means who died when I was 18, leaving debts that consumed what little we had. My mother followed him 6 years ago. I live in rented rooms in an unfashionable part of London, surviving on a small income from a trust my grandmother established before her death." She watched Sebastian's face as she spoke, searching for the moment when disappointment would set in, when he'd realize the magnitude of the gulf between them, the impossibility of what he was proposing. But his expression didn't change. If anything, he looked more intent, more focused on her words, leaning slightly forward, as though afraid of missing any detail. "I'm a nobody," Amelia continued, the words tumbling out faster now, driven by a need to lay everything bare before her courage failed. "The kind of woman society barely notices. I'm invited to events out of politeness and forgotten the moment I leave. I've learned to be invisible, because visibility only brings painful comparisons to everything I'm not. I have no dowry to offer, no family name to lend consequence, no accomplishments beyond surviving each day with some measure of dignity intact." Her voice caught, but she forced herself to continue. "I'm poor, aging, and utterly unsuitable for a man in your position. Society will say I trapped you, that I'm a fortune hunter who manipulated your mother into arranging these meetings. They'll whisper that I'm too old, too poor, too insignificant to be a duchess, and they'll be right about all of it, except the manipulation. I never sought this, never imagined it was possible. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't bother wiping them away. She needed to finish, to say everything before he could interrupt with kind rejections or practical considerations. Your mother sought me out at a tea. She said she'd been watching me, that she thought I might be someone you could talk to without pretense. And I agreed because, her voice broke completely, because for once in my life, I wanted to matter to someone. I wanted to be seen, not as a charity case or a poor relation, but as a person worthy of attention, worthy of being known. She took a shaky breath, forcing out the last confession. I fell in love with you knowing it was impossible, knowing that this could only end in heartbreak. But I couldn't help it. You made me feel alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. You made me believe for a few Thursday afternoons that I might be enough just as I am. And now I've told you the truth, and you'll realize what a terrible mistake this has all been, and stop. Sebastian closed the distance between them in 2 quick strides, taking her hands in his. His grip was warm and solid, anchoring her. Please stop. I'm sorry, she whispered, trying to pull away but finding he wouldn't let her. I should have told you sooner. I should have been honest from the beginning instead of letting you believe I might be someone suitable. Amelia. He said her name like a prayer, like something precious and irreplaceable. The sound of her real name in his voice, spoken with such tenderness, nearly undid her completely. Do you honestly think any of that matters to me? She looked up at him, confusion mingling with desperate hope. How could it not matter? You're a duke. You need to marry someone appropriate, someone with a fortune and connections, someone who can be a proper duchess and navigate society and host grand events without embarrassing you. I need to marry someone I can talk to at breakfast without wanting to throw myself from the window, Sebastian said, and despite everything, she almost laughed at the dry humor in his voice. I need someone who makes me want to come home at the end of difficult days, someone who understands the weight I carry and helps me remember why it's worth bearing. He lifted one hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing away her tears with infinite gentleness. The gesture was so tender, it made her chest ache. I need you, Amelia. Not your fortune or your family connections or your social standing. Just you, the woman who quotes philosophy and argues about poetry and looks at me like I'm worth knowing beyond my title. But your duty, my duty is to care for my estates and my tenants, and to serve in the Lords with honor. None of that requires me to marry someone I don't love. His voice took on an edge of steel, the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions and standing by them. My father married for duty, and while he and my mother grew fond of each other, they never had what we have, this connection, this understanding. He spent his entire life serving obligation and died never having known genuine partnership. Sebastian's other hand came up to frame her face, holding her gently but firmly, making her meet his eyes, making her see the absolute certainty there. I won't make the same mistake. I won't sacrifice happiness for the approval of people whose opinions ultimately mean nothing. I've spent 7 years being the perfect duke, doing everything society expected of me, and I've been miserable. Then I spent a few Thursday afternoons with you and I remembered what it felt like to be happy. People will talk, Amelia whispered, but she could feel her resistance crumbling. They'll say terrible things. That I'm a fortune hunter, that I trapped you somehow, that I'm too old, too poor, too insignificant. Let them talk, we'll know the truth. He smiled slightly, and it transformed his entire face. Though I suspect my mother will terrorize anyone foolish enough to say such things in her hearing. She's rather protective of people she cares about. Despite her tears, despite her fear, Amelia felt laughter bubble up. She's rather formidable, isn't she? She's a force of nature, and she adores you, by the way. She told me last week that if I was fool enough to let you go, she'd disown me and adopt you instead. She didn't. She absolutely did. I believe her exact words were that she'd rather have a genuine daughter with no fortune than a false one with a castle. He pulled Amelia closer until they were barely inches apart, until she could feel his warmth and see every shade of grey in his eyes. My mother has excellent judgment. I should have listened to her years ago. Sebastian. His name felt strange and wonderful on her lips, without the pretense of Mr. Blackwood, without the careful distance they'd maintained. This is madness. You realize that? There are 1,000 reasons why this can't work. Name one that matters. She opened her mouth to respond, ready with a list of practical objections and social impossibilities. But when she looked at him, when she felt the solid reality of his hands on her face and saw the love shining in his eyes, all those 1,000 reasons seemed to evaporate like morning mist. Because what did society's opinion matter compared to this? What did money or titles or proper connections matter when weighed against being truly known and truly loved? I can't, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. When I'm with you, nothing else seems important. Then marry me. The words were soft but certain, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Not because of duty or obligation or social expectation. Marry me because you love me and I love you, and life is too short to spend it pretending otherwise. Amelia's heart was racing so fast she thought it might burst from her chest. You're asking me to be a duchess. I'm asking you to be my wife. The duchess part is just an unfortunate side effect. His smile turned mischievous, playful in a way that made him look years younger. Though I suspect you'll be better at it than you think. You already manage to navigate social situations with grace while being almost entirely ignored. Imagine what you could accomplish if people actually had to pay attention to you. She laughed through her tears, the sound breaking free like something that had been trapped too long. You're completely mad. Quite possibly. Is that a yes? Was it? Could she really do this? Step into a life she'd never imagined, face down the scrutiny and gossip, learn to be something she'd never been trained for. Could she trust that love would be enough to bridge the enormous gulf between who she was and who she'd need to become? But then she looked at Sebastian's face, at the hope and love shining there, and she realized the question wasn't whether she could do it. The question was whether she was brave enough to try. Whether she could take the risk of reaching for happiness instead of settling for the safety of invisibility. She thought of Margaret's words about fear being a compass, about 1 year of genuine happiness being worth more than a lifetime of comfortable misery. She thought of all the years stretching ahead if she said no, years of quiet rooms and careful economies, years of being invisible and alone, years of wondering what might have been. And she thought of what Sebastian had said about his father, spending an entire life serving duty and never knowing genuine partnership, never experiencing this kind of consuming, transformative love. Yes, she whispered. Then louder, more certain, feeling the word transform everything. Yes, I'll marry you. The kiss that followed was nothing like the chaste touches described in romance novels. It was real and desperate, and full of all the fear and hope and love they'd been holding back for weeks. Amelia felt as though she was falling and flying simultaneously, every nerve alive with sensation, her entire world narrowing to the point of contact between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and slightly dazed, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers. I should probably do this properly, with a ring and a formal proposal and all the appropriate ceremony. We've done nothing properly since the beginning. Why start now? He laughed, the sound full of pure joy and relief. Excellent point. Then his expression sobered slightly. Though I should warn you, my mother is probably watching from the window and will descend on us momentarily with champagne and 1,000 plans. As if summoned by his words, the cottage door opened and Margaret emerged, carrying a bottle and 3 glasses with the air of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Finally, she called out, her voice carrying across the garden. I was beginning to worry you'd both be too stubborn to admit what's been obvious for weeks. Sebastian groaned good-naturedly. You were listening? Certainly not. That would be improper. Margaret's expression was utterly unrepentant, her eyes sparkling with satisfaction and delight. I was simply observing, from a respectful distance, with the window open because the room was stuffy. Amelia found herself laughing, the sound mixing with Sebastian's as they walked toward Margaret together. The Dowager Duchess set down the glasses and pulled Amelia into an embrace that was both fierce and gentle. "Welcome to the family, my dear," she whispered against Amelia's hair. "Oh, you're going to be magnificent." They drank champagne in the garden as afternoon faded toward evening, making plans and adjusting them, laughing at Margaret's increasingly outrageous suggestions for the wedding. The Dowager Duchess wanted something grand, a statement that would silence critics before they could start talking. Sebastian wanted something intimate, just family and close friends. Amelia found she didn't care as long as it ended with her married to the man who'd somehow seen past every barrier she'd erected. "We should discuss practicalities," Margaret said eventually, ever the pragmatist beneath her eccentricity. "The announcement will need to be carefully managed. Society will have questions." "Let them question," Sebastian said, his arm around Amelia's waist as though he couldn't bear to stop touching her. "We'll answer with the truth, that I met a remarkable woman and had the good sense to ask her to marry me before anyone else realized how extraordinary she was. They'll want to know about her family, her connections. Then we'll tell them." Margaret pulled out the paper she'd shown Amelia earlier. Amelia's grandfather was Sir Thomas Whitmore, a baronet. Her grandmother was Lady Catherine Pemberton before her marriage, daughter of the Earl of Fairmont. Both respected families even if their fortunes have waned. She smiled at Amelia with something like pride. "I did some research, my dear. You have more respectable connections than you realize. They simply haven't been useful to you because you've had no one to champion your cause. But that changes now." "You researched my family," Amelia said, though she already knew this from their conversation in the park. "Of course. I needed to know who I was introducing to my son." Margaret's expression turned gentle, her voice taking on that maternal warmth that had first drawn Amelia to trust her. "But I want you to understand something, Amelia. Even if you'd had no family connections at all, even if you'd been born in a gutter with no name and no history, I would still have chosen you, because you're exactly what Sebastian needs. Someone real, someone kind, someone brave enough to love him for himself rather than his title." Amelia felt tears threatening again and blinked them back. She'd cried enough for one day. "Thank you for seeing me, for giving me this chance, for believing I could be enough." "Thank yourself for being worth seeing," Margaret replied firmly. "Now shall we discuss wedding dates? I think spring would be lovely, April perhaps. That gives us time to prepare properly without rushing, and the gardens at Thornbury Manor will be spectacular." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind that left Amelia dizzy with change. The announcement appeared in all the appropriate papers, sparking exactly the gossip Margaret had predicted. Who was this Miss Whitmore? Where had she come from? How had she captured the Duke of Thornbury, when so many more suitable candidates had failed? Amelia endured the scrutiny with Sebastian at her side, learning to navigate the attention she'd spent so long avoiding. Some of society's matrons were gracious, welcoming her warmly once they understood her family connections. Others were less kind, making cutting remarks about fortune hunters and unsuitable matches that they barely bothered to disguise. But Margaret moved through society like an avenging angel, defending Amelia with such fierce loyalty that even the bravest gossips learned to hold their tongues. The Dowager Duchess made it clear that anyone who insulted her future daughter-in-law would find themselves permanently excluded from her considerable social influence. Sebastian introduced Amelia to his world gradually, giving her time to adjust. They attended small dinners before moving to larger events. He showed her the London townhouse where he spent part of each year, the elegant rooms that would become her home. He explained the household management, the staff hierarchy, the social obligations that came with his position. It was overwhelming, but never as terrifying as Amelia had feared. Because Sebastian was always there, patient and encouraging, making it clear that he valued her thoughts even when she didn't know proper procedures. He asked for her opinions on everything from menu planning to charitable endeavors, treating her as a partner rather than an ornament. "You don't have to know everything immediately," he told her one evening when she was frustrated by her ignorance of some social nuance. "You'll learn. And honestly, half of what society considers important is arbitrary nonsense anyway. Just be yourself. That's all I ask." The first visit to Thornbury Manor, Sebastian's principal estate, took Amelia's breath away. The house was magnificent, centuries old, sprawling across manicured grounds that seemed to extend forever. But what struck her most wasn't the grandeur but the warmth. The staff greeted Sebastian with genuine affection, not just deference. The housekeeper, Mrs. Crawford, welcomed Amelia with motherly kindness, clearly delighted that the Duke had finally chosen a bride. "We'd begun to worry he'd never settle," Mrs. Crawford confided, as she showed Amelia through the house. "He's been so lonely since his father passed." Oh, he put on a good face, but those of us who've known him since he was a boy could see the sadness. It's good to see him smile again. The tenants proved equally welcoming. Sebastian took Amelia on a tour of the estate, introducing her to farming families who'd lived on Thornbury land for generations. They were curious but kind, assessing her with the practical eye of people who knew their Duke's happiness would affect their own lives. Amelia found herself genuinely interested in their concerns: crop rotations and drainage issues, the state of cottages, and the education of children. These were real problems affecting real people, not the artificial dramas of London society. She asked questions, listened carefully, and began to understand that being a duchess wasn't just about hosting parties and wearing expensive clothes. It was about responsibility, about using privilege to improve lives. "You're going to be wonderful at this," Sebastian said as they walked back to the manor after visiting a tenant family. "You care about people, really care. That's rare in our world." The wedding took place on a brilliantly sunny April morning, exactly as Margaret had planned. The Dowager Duchess had won the argument for something grand, but she'd conceded to Sebastian's request for intimacy by limiting the guest list to people who actually mattered to them. The ceremony was held in the small chapel on the Thornbury estate, with flowers cascading from every surface and sunlight streaming through stained glass windows that painted rainbows across the stone floor. Amelia walked down the aisle alone, having no father or brother to give her away. But she held her head high because she was choosing this herself. She was walking toward her future with open eyes and an open heart, no longer invisible, but fully, gloriously seen. Sebastian waited at the altar, looking devastatingly handsome in formal dress. But it was his expression that made her breath catch. Wonder and love and gratitude all mingled together, as though he couldn't quite believe his good fortune in finding her, as though she was the answer to prayers he hadn't dared voice. The vows were traditional, but the weight they carried was anything but. When Sebastian promised to love and honor her, she heard all the Thursday afternoons in his voice, all the conversations that had built this foundation. When she promised the same, she thought of the courage it had taken to step into this life, to trust that love might be enough to bridge the gulf between who she'd been and who she was becoming. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." The words seemed to echo through the chapel, making everything real in a way it hadn't been before. Sebastian kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise, and the small gathering erupted in applause. The wedding breakfast was a joyful affair, full of toasts and laughter and good-natured teasing. Margaret gave a speech that had everyone alternatively laughing and wiping their eyes, talking about the importance of choosing love over convention and praising Amelia's courage in ways that made her blush furiously. Sebastian's friends, those few he truly trusted, welcomed Amelia with genuine warmth. They seemed delighted to see their friend happy, relieved that he'd finally found someone who appreciated him for himself rather than his title. As evening approached and guests began to depart, Sebastian and Amelia found a moment alone in the garden. The same garden where he'd proposed, now bursting with spring growth. Everything was in bloom, roses and lilacs and a dozen other flowers creating a riot of color and scent. "Happy?" Sebastian asked, pulling her close. "Terrified," Amelia admitted. "Overwhelmed, grateful, happy beyond words." She looked up at him. "All of it at once. Good. That means you're fully alive." He kissed her forehead with infinite tenderness. "I have something for you, a wedding gift." He produced a small box from his pocket. Inside was a key, old and ornate and somehow familiar. "It's to the cottage," he explained, "in Richmond, where we met. I've arranged for it to be maintained year-round. I thought perhaps we could go there sometimes, when the demands of this life become too much. A place where we can just be Sebastian and Amelia again, without the weight of titles and expectations. Amelia felt tears spill over, but they were happy tears this time. The gesture was so thoughtful, so perfectly attuned to what she needed, that it made her chest ache with love. "It's perfect, thank you. There's one more thing." He pulled out an envelope. "I've established a school, in your name, for girls whose families can't afford proper education. You said once that you wanted to teach, to help others discover the joy of learning. This way you can." She stared at the papers detailing the school's charter, the building purchased in a nearby village, the teachers already hired. It was everything she'd dreamed of as a young woman, before life had taught her to settle for less. "Sebastian, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll help me run it. Say we'll work together to make it something meaningful." He smiled, and it carried all the love and hope and partnership she could have wished for. "I've learned that the weight of duty is much lighter when shared with someone you love." They stood in the garden as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, two people who'd found each other against all odds. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges to face, society to navigate, expectations to either meet or defy. But they would face it together. "Do you ever think about that first Thursday?" Amelia asked. "How terrified we both were. How neither of us knew what we were walking into." "Every day. I think about how close I came to missing this. To missing you." He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I think about my grandmother who ran off with a younger son and never regretted choosing love over practicality, and I understand now what my mother meant about 1 year of genuine happiness being worth more than a lifetime of comfortable misery. Except we don't just have 1 year. No, if I'm very lucky, we have 50 or 60, maybe more." His smile turned tender, full of all the years he was imagining stretching before them. "And I plan to make every single one of them count." As they walked back toward the house, where Margaret was no doubt orchestrating the evening's festivities with her usual efficient chaos, Amelia thought about the journey that had brought her here. From invisibility to being seen, from resignation to hope, from loneliness to love. It had started with nothing more than afternoon tea, a chance encounter arranged by a woman who saw potential where society saw nothing, and it had become everything. The future stretched before them, full of possibility and promise. There would be difficult days, certainly, moments when the weight of expectation felt crushing, times when Amelia would doubt her place in this world she'd never been trained for, when the whispers about fortune hunters and unsuitable matches would sting more than she cared to admit. But there would also be Thursday afternoons at the cottage, where they could remember who they were beneath the titles. There would be the school, giving other girls the chances Amelia had never had, breaking cycles of limited opportunity. There would be quiet evenings in the library at Thornbury Manor, reading together by firelight, discussing ideas and dreams with the easy intimacy of true partnership. There would be laughter and conversation, and the simple joy of being truly known by another person. Most of all, there would be love. Real, honest, hard-won love that had survived deception and fear and the weight of impossible circumstances. Love that had looked past titles and fortunes to see the people underneath. Love that had chosen courage over safety, authenticity over pretense. As they reached the house and Sebastian opened the door for her, Amelia paused on the threshold. She looked back at the garden, at the sky darkening toward night, at the life she was leaving behind, a life of invisibility and careful economies, of resignation and quiet survival. Then she looked forward, at the man waiting to lead her into her new life, at the warmth and light spilling from the house, at all the possibilities that had seemed impossible just months ago. "Ready?" Sebastian asked, his hand extended toward her. "Yes," Amelia replied, taking his hand and feeling his fingers close warm and sure around hers. "I'm ready." And together they stepped into the light and warmth of home, leaving the shadows of the past behind forever. The future was uncertain, full of challenges they couldn't yet imagine, but they would face it together, partners in every sense of the word. It had been only afternoon tea, after all, nothing more than porcelain and politeness and a dowager duchess's audacious plan. But from those simple beginnings had grown something extraordinary. A love story that proved authenticity could triumph over pretense, that courage could overcome fear, that being truly seen was worth every risk. The end. Dear listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey through Amelia and Sebastian's story. We hope their courage to love authentically, despite society's expectations and their own fears, has touched your heart as deeply as it has touched ours here at Echoes of Romance. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most profound connections come when we dare to be vulnerable, when we choose honesty over performance, when we trust that being ourselves is enough. It shows us that love isn't about perfection or suitability as society defines it, but about finding someone who sees us, truly sees us, and chooses us anyway. If this story resonated with you, if you found yourself hoping for Amelia and Sebastian, rooting for their happy ending despite all the obstacles, we'd be so grateful if you could take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment sharing your favorite moment from the story, whether it was their first meeting, their walks in the garden, or the moment they finally chose courage over fear. Give us a like to let us know you enjoyed this journey with us. And please don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. We're here every week with tales of love, courage, and hope. Stories about people who dare to reach for happiness even when the world tells them it's impossible. Remember, true love isn't about titles or fortunes or meeting society's expectations. It's about finding someone who sees you, truly sees you, for exactly who you are. Someone who makes you want to be brave, to step out of the shadows, to believe that you deserve to be loved. May you all find your own Thursday afternoon tea moment, that unexpected encounter that changes everything, that person who makes you feel alive and seen and worthy of love. Until next time, dear listeners, may your hearts be full and your courage strong. With love and endless romance, Echoes of Romance.